All right, so hi guys, we're in the final stretch of this semester. Um, I'm going to keep on making content for this class, even though the last video I posted got 0 views or 1 view, something sad like that. But I'm going to keep on persisting here. We're going to do what we need to do. Um, I really hope that maybe some of you guys spend some time over the next little bit, kind of catching up here, maybe reviewing some of the previous content that you missed. Um, well, we'll see. So today I wanted to follow up on our film that we watched, The Experimenter. And one of the reasons why is because The Experimenter deals specifically with a clinical psychologist, Milgram, Stanley Milgram, and his experiments behind authority and the and how people react to authority, being told to do things by people in authority. And he is a clinical psychologist, which is a branch of the sciences called the human sciences. And typically, whenever we think of the sciences, we think of chemistry and physics, and biology. The like really hard sciences. But human sciences are sciences as well, but they're very different from those natural sciences or those hard sciences. So I wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of the human sciences and what makes them different, and kind of how they are doing the same process as the natural sciences, but in very different ways. So, yeah, so we're going to take a little look at the human sciences today. Hopefully, it doesn't take us too long to get through it, um, and then we'll do a follow up there. So the most basic of the human sciences is the actual study of just humans, which we call anthropology. And anthropology is just the study of human beings, and it's the most broadest. It's the most broadest of the human sciences, because it looks at the evolutionary history of the human. It looks at how we look at racial classifications and where we draw those lines. It looks at historical and present day human geography, group dynamics, cultural history. All of that kind of falls under the umbrella of anthropology, and it's really just the study of the human species, kind of from the most vast and pulled back level. Then we start to get more specific, and we get into things like geography. And a lot of times we think of geography and we just think about knowing locations on a map. Some of you maybe took human geography as in your freshman or sophomore year. When you really get into geography, the idea of geography is studying the way that humans interact, or just life interacts with the land that it inhabits, and how humans, people, animals move in that land, right? And so when we talk about the like human sciences, we're talking specifically about human geography. So how people groups move, how they react to their landscape, how human existence is different in one geographic location compared to another location, the way that there is a relationship between a people and the place that they inhabit. All of that is kind of covered under geography. Then we get into sociology, which is the study of human societies, and how we work as groups. So anthropology is kind of looking at the species as a whole. Geography is looking at the relationship between humans and the areas that they inhabit and the world. Sociology is looking at the relation at the it is saying the way that humans relate to each other, culturally, socially, and different types of like societies. All of that is sociology, the way that we participate in groups, the way that we relate to each other. And sometimes that's small group dynamics, and we have sociology that studies small groups, and then sometimes it's larger groups, cultural studies, things like that. Then there's psychology, which is the study of just the like individual. And you can see how I'm kind of scaling down here, right? And psychology is just the study of the individual, the mind, how the individual reacts to their environment, to other people, to stimulus. And so it's really about trying to understand what we consider to be the core a person. Now, that's debatable as to whether or not the mind is the core of a person. I think there are many evolutionary biologists that might argue that it is the genome. But I think that humans, whenever they think of themselves, and you think, like what makes you you, you're going to consistently get two answers, which is either the soul or the mind, depending on kind of which perspective you take on that, right? And so psychology is really studying the like human mind and how it relates to itself and then other people. Um, and then political science, which is the way that humans form ruling organizations, and then the way that they interact with those, and then how individuals act inside of those different systems. Because like maybe humans act differently in a democracy versus a plutocracy, or a monarchy, or a or social democratic society. So like, how do those things work, right? And so that is political science. And then economics is really the study of. So we think of like economics, and we think of money, but that's not really the root of economics. The real root of like economic study is production. How do we make things, and then how do we consume things, and then how do we distribute the things that we make? And oftentimes especially in our modern society, that involves money and the exchange of currency. But that's not always true if you look at like historical economies, right? And then you get back to the barter system, you get back to the caste system, or to the like feudal system, where money was much less important as things like housing and things like that. So economics is about the real like production and distribution of goods. All right. So so the idea of the human sciences is that they are this large umbrella that kind of covers a lot of things. And then we've got these other things that are kind of like tangentially related to them as well, meaning that like it's hard to study the human sciences without also getting into these areas, right? Linguistics, the study of language and how humans communicate. Like, how can you study sociology, or political science, without studying the language that we use and the way that we communicate ideas? Things like criminology are deeply tied into our studies of like sociology, international relations, business and management studies, religious studies, archaeology, history. All these things overlap with the human sciences. So there's no like, you can't avoid them. You have to. They are kind of embedded into the human sciences themselves. So what are the human sciences trying to do? So the idea of the human sciences is basically they want to generate knowledge about human behavior and the interactions of humans in societies on both a micro, meaning small, and macro, meaning big scale, right? And really, they want to understand the influences on like human behavior, and then the underlying patterns that emerge. So, can we make predictive statements, or can we find causal relationships, or correlations between stimulus and then behaviors? Um, and so all of that then leads us to then better understand how human decisions are made, or how we might predict human behavior, or how we might make better informed decisions as a species, right? Um, so some of these things though make it difficult, because the human studies are unique in several aspects. So the first is that humans are both the subject of the study and the students and the people doing the like study, right? So they are the studier, the subjects, and then the students of these sciences, and that can make them muddled, right? Because what that means is that we're bringing all of our inherent biases to our ideas of what humanness is, and these kind of preconceived ideas of what we have with us, with us. And a lot of the times we look at things through our own social construct, because we are humans and we are part of groups and we have our own psychology, and we have our own politics. And so sometimes it can be hard for the researcher to divorce those things, or their own knowledge or lack of knowledge gets in the way. So for instance, these like Martians, right? If they just observed humans, right? Hold on. My microphone. There we go. All right. So if we had a bunch of humans just observing, or sorry, if we had a bunch of Martians just observing humans, and they couldn't ask questions, they couldn't interact. All they could do was just observe and like record data. They might come to some kind of conclusions like, oh, all the cars break down every time that a light turns red. That's what makes cars break. And the reason why is that objectively, from just an observational standpoint, that makes sense, right? That is not an irrational conclusion to reach based off of the observational data. The issue is that it's the wrong conclusion. And so we know that because we have the context necessary, right? But imagine that a Martian observing human behavior absent the context, right, might reach wrong conclusions. Well, humans also are prone to those things. When we are just observing and recording data, it might lead us to reach faulty conclusions, especially because we might lack the requisite context to have those things have meaning. So, wir wichten, all right, probably means nothing to you, right? That is probably nonsense sounds. I might as well have gone ich schlag Bachen, right? It doesn't matter because you lack the context to realize that that says I understand, because that's literally what that translates to, right? If I started speaking in Japanese, like watashi wa no name Andrew Sensei doji yoroshiku onegaishimasu, you don't have any context for that, and so it's just gibberish, right? That doesn't mean that it's meaningless, but context motivates a lot of human behavior and a lot of our knowledge, and so it makes it hard to study because in order to have the right context for something means that you are also embedded in the cultural biases that might make that harder to study. So things that are often said about the human sciences. The human sciences still struggle to this day to be taken as seriously as some of the harder sciences, and there's a bevy of reasons why. So, one, the things that like we just talked about, that the human sciences are permeated with values and value judgments, and that people are bringing their own biases to these things with them. The concepts in social sciences are very vague and imprecise. We're not making discrete measurements of minute changes. We're making very broad, vague statements. There's an unavoidable interaction between the scientist and what he studies because it is a human studying other humans. It leads to all kinds of problems with the nature of the study themselves, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And a human scientist cannot state and verify hypotheses with precision and universality, meaning that the human scientists really struggle to prove what we call causality. And causality is whenever you hit a barrier, or sorry, whenever you have enough data with strong enough evidence that you can say this causes this, and that you can replicate it over and over and over and over and over again and say this always causes this. And that's whenever something becomes a scientific law, whenever it is verifiable and replicatable a whole lot, right? The human sciences really struggle with this. Typically, the best that they can ever get to is what we call correlation, which is this has a relationship with this. Eating the right foods has a relationship with good test scores. We can't say that eating good food causes good test scores because we have people that eat good foods and still have crap test scores, right? But we do know that there is a relationship between people that have good nutritional habits and people who do well on tests. And that's the issue, right? Is that because there are so many variables, because humans are so complex, because our outcomes and our actions are so nuanced and so complex, it becomes impossible to isolate what causes us to do anything in and of itself. So instead, all that we can really point to are our relationships. And then what that means is that then no social scientist can actually make any real predictions with any kind of assurance because they can't prove causality. Um, so how are the human sciences done, right? So questionnaires and surveys, right? So I have a human sciences background. I have a doctorate degree in the human sciences. I have a doctorate degree in educational theory and professionalism, where I did an entire scientific study. And my study was done through focus groups and what are called Likert scale surveys. Likert scale surveys are those 5-point surveys that you get all of the time. You've all taken them. You just don't know what they're called, but they're the ones that have like strongly disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree, and that 5 points. That's called a Likert scale. And then so I give out a lot of Likert scale surveys. I did some focus groups with smaller groups where I went through and I asked them specific questions, and then I had to do what is called quantifying the responses. And that's kind of a like interview. It's just with multiple people. We do raw observational data where we just kind of observe things, and what we do is we'll have like a chart and things that we are trying to observe, and then we only mark how many times we have observed that particular thing. So that's the only way to try and keep the data pure. If you just kind of like wrote down what you saw all of the time, it becomes too muddled. Um, and then obviously gathering and the interpretation of statistics. This is where you get things like the normal distribution. Um, I think you guys have probably covered the normal distribution before. This is the normal distribution. Um, and the normal distribution basically is the curve of averages in any given data set. So it looks like this, right? So anytime that you're looking at behaviors or outcomes or something like that, you can use a normal distribution to make sense of it. So let's take ACT scores, right? So a 21 is the middle ACT score. That's the average ACT score. And that means that would be right here. Imagine that we've got a 21 right here. I don't have my pen tool, or else I would just draw it. But if we got a 21 right here, that means that 68% of people are going to be within one standard deviation of a 21. Standard deviation on the ACT is 3 points, I think. So that means that 68% of students are going to be between an 18 and a 24. All right, that's where the vast majority of all students that take the ACT are going to be between the 18 and the 24. And that's what these percentages are. 34% will be lower than that, 34% will be higher than that. Then between the next standard deviations, so the next 4 points between that 24 and that 28, only 13% of all the test takers will score between a 24 and a 28. And then a 28 and a 32, right, is going to be 2%. Only 2% of the ACT test takers will score between a 28 and a 32. And then obviously the 32 plus scores, which is the 32, 33, 34, is going to be less than 1%. And this is the normal distribution. And any time that you've gathered a large amount of like data, you can put it on a normal distribution and figure out, these are called the standard deviations, to figure out how far apart from the averages they are. And so this is just one of the kind of ways that we use statistics to try and understand things. So like if I say you're 2 standard deviations above average, well, here's 1 standard deviation above average, here's 2 standard deviations above average. So you can see that makes you significantly above average, right? Conversely, if I say you're 2 standard deviations below average, wow, you're in really bad shape. So it's a way of understanding large sets of data. Anyway, sorry, I got off. We study written sources, history, official books. We gather data from those. We study artifacts. That's archaeology. And then we conduct experiments like in The Experimenter. And psychology does this a lot, where they come up with unique psychological experiments to to try and get as close to a causal relationship as possible. And the idea of these experiments is to get rid of as many variables as possible to try and really understand what is affecting the thing that you're wanting to study as closely as possible. So let's keep going here. All right. I'm going to try and speed up because I know I'm running long. Sorry, I'm already at 20 minutes. Dang. Oof. You know what? We might have to break this up into two videos. We'll see. Um, so, problems with some of these problems with some of these methods. Surveys. You got a big problem with the scope in the scale, right? Meaning that the better survey data that you get involve more questions, because what you really want is you want people to be able to answer the same question 3 or 4 times in the midst of a survey to make sure that their answers remain consistent. But the problem is that what we found is that the more questions that you put on a survey, the less likely you are to get responses, and the more likely that the responses are of low quality. So we end up with this problem where you're constantly trying to balance having enough questions to make the survey useful and like consistent, with having so many that then people don't do it. And then you've got the sample size and choice, meaning if I want to know about all humans, I've got to somehow give my survey to a group of people that represents all humans. Can you see how this would be problematic, especially if I lived in someplace like America? How could I give my survey to all kinds of humans? Especially, like, you could say, well, use the internet. But then what about humans that don't have the internet? In places like rural China or in rural Africa or in Mongolia, where the internet just is not a thing. How can I get that? So I can't. And now we're starting to hit the limitations of now I can't make broad statements about human behavior. All I can say are things like students at Antioch High School say blank. Well, and then that's the question of how useful is that? Because the sample size is so limited. Is that even useful anymore? And then you've got the questioner bias, which is, are we writing unbiased questions or not? And that's a whole loaded thing that I will not get into with you guys because you will probably never need to know about it. And then the quality of the answers. You've done this. You're guilty of this. You're given a survey and you just put down all fives or all ones. You either love or hate everything as much as possible, right? You don't take the surveys seriously. So the problem is that happens a lot. But if you end up with a bunch of people that just put all fives, well, then it skews all of your data way over here. Or if you have people that have all ones, well, then it skews your data all the way over here, right? Because they aren't answering honestly. So then you've got to go through this arduous task of, well, which of these people took this seriously? Which of these people's answers do we think we should count versus we shouldn't? And then you've got the bias of how do you decide that? And then that becomes problematic as well. We're going to skip that. So, other issues in experimentation. So, because there are people as a subject, there becomes the possibility of an interaction between the people doing the study and then the subjects. So you saw in the film, Milgram never actually interacts with the patients, right? He's got the glass up and he's behind the glass and he's just making the observations, and then he has other people actually interfacing with them, so that way he can remain as unbiased as possible in his observations and hopefully not taint it. You've got this Margaret Mead. Was a social scientist who went and lived with some American Samoas way back in the 1920s because she wanted to know if adolescence for the American Samoas was the same kind of really hard, tumultuous time for them as it was for American teenagers. And the problem that she ran into once she got out there is that she was tainting them with her expectations. And so then they started acting the way that they thought that she wanted them to act. And so then all of her research becomes problematic and becomes questionable because they start acting the way that she expects them to act. She expects the girls to be fraught or whatever, or she expects them to not be because she thinks that they're less civilized or whatever. And so then they start to fulfill that. And maybe they are fulfilling that because they can pick pick up on that, or maybe they are fulfilling that because she's biased in what she's observing and the things that she's making note of, and then the things that she's glossing over or is deciding are unimportant. And then there's the Hawthorne effect, and you guys have done this whenever you have a principal come into the classroom to observe a teacher. You act different when the principal is in the classroom than you do whenever the principal is not. Which, by the way, thanks for that. As a teacher, that's a nice thing because typically you guys are on better behavior, you are more engaged, you try harder, right? But the mere fact that you know that there's somebody there watching changes your behavior. Well, that means from a social scientist perspective, right, that then we have to really question anybody that is aware that they are being observed. Their actions might not be their authentic actions, which then makes the results completely suspect. So, and then obviously, almost all of the experiments are very, very hard to replicate. We tried to replicate studies and then see how closely results align, but it's almost impossible to replicate the exact dynamics of like any given study because you're dealing with people, and people are not the same, right? So if I do a study, and let's say that I'm going to use my students, right? And so I do my study first with my IB seniors, right? And I do a study with them and I give them surveys and I ask them interview questions and I do observations, right? I could do the exact same study with you guys, my IB juniors, and get completely different results because you're different people, you've had different experiences, you're at a different place in your education, you've got different home lives. All these things can change the results. And so it becomes almost impossible to fully replicate. And then we get the ethical problems. Obviously, the Milgram experiment had its own ethical dilemmas with causing psychological harm, and then also people not being able to consent to what was done with them. One of the things about the Milgram experiment that people don't talk about enough is that he was hiding what the experiment was actually about, so nobody was actually able to consent to the experiment. They consented to what they thought the experiment was, but that was not what the actual experiment was, and so they were never able to actually give consent for what was being studied. And then there's the Stanford prison experiment where oh, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit next week. Anyways, they put a bunch of Stanford students in the basement of a building and they randomly selected some to be prisoners and some to be wardens or jailers. And they ran it, they tried to run it for like 2 weeks. They had to cancel it early because things got really out of hand. And it was not done in a way that protected the people participating. Some terrible things happened. And so it has raised a lot of ethical considerations on how do we ethically try and experiment on people without hurting them. How can we manipulate people to try and study specific things and try to gain knowledge about human behavior in regards to like specific stimulus without potentially harming them. And so it's been very, very, very problematic. So another big problem is the idea that the root of human science is that the scientific method and scientific methodology is sufficient for knowing all things, including humans and human interactions. But it begs the question, like, can everything be measured scientifically? Will we ever be able to scientifically measure thoughts in a child, or what happiness is, or what love is? Can we ever really fully understand economics with as many variables as there are in the world between natural resources and disasters and different people and cultures? Or is it something that we can only ever kind of like look at sideways from a distance? And then that gets down to, are statistics and numbers a fair way to represent human existence and human experience? Or is there something about human existence that is more than just numbers and that requires more than just numbers? And I think that those are both very, very fair questions to ask. We're going to skip this. And then I've already talked about correlation versus causation, but here's a couple of examples, right? So, Facebook users have lower overall grades than non users, according to a survey of college students. So they asked a bunch of college students what their GPA were, and then they asked them if they had a Facebook, and then they looked to see if there was a correlation, a relationship between people that use Facebook and people's grades. And they found out that people that use Facebook have lower grades. Does that mean that Facebook causes lower grades? No, it doesn't. It just means that there's a relationship between those two things. And so, what that ultimately means, what they're really saying is that this might be part of the things that cause lower grades. It might be one piece of a much larger puzzle. But people that do this might also do this. It's like you'll see like article occasionally that's something like studies show that eating a little Debbie snack uh, might cause higher risk of heart attack. And what they're saying basically is that they did a study of people that have had heart attacks and asked them if they have ever eaten Little Debbie's, and they've done a study, and then they asked a bunch of people that have never had a heart attack and asked them if they eat Little Debbie's, and they show that there's a relationship between eating Little Debbie's and having heart attacks. Does that mean the Little Debbie's cause heart attacks? Probably not. What it means is that the kind of person that's likely to eat a bunch of Little Debbie's snacks is probably not the kind of person leading a super healthy lifestyle in general. So it's one part of a much larger picture, right? Because we can infer that if they are eating Little Debbie's, they're probably eating much more junk food, or they're drinking a lot of soda, cheers, right? Or whatever other unhealthy habits. And so when you couch it like that, it's almost like a no duh statement, right? But then it makes for these great clickbait articles, so they keep on putting it out there. So moving on. We're going to skip this. We're going to skip this. We're going to skip this. I had a lot more stuff here that I want to talk about. So, here's another good example of things that make the human sciences hard. So, the idea of the placebo and the nocebo. So, a placebo is where we give, like, we've got a bunch of people and we're going to give them vitamin C to see if it makes them feel happier, right? And so, what we do is we get 1,000 people and we give 500 vitamin C, and then we give 500 of them something that we say is vitamin C, but it's really not anything. It's just like flour or something, right? And we give it to them, and they take it, and then we see if the people who took the vitamin C are happier or not. However, what we found is that if people expect something is going to make them better, they start to feel better even if they're not actually taking anything. So what we found is the placebo effect is actually real. And what's even crazier is that it even works if you know that it's a placebo. But the placebo effect is this way that like your mind anticipates something to happen, so it makes it happen. And so that makes it very, very hard to test some of these things. And then there was a nocebo, which is where you don't have anything, where like you don't give them anything. You tell them that you're going to do something, and then you don't do it, and you see what they do. So a classic example of this was in the 1980s. They were told they were going to get a mild electrical current through their brains, right? That it was going to be some kind of a test, right? And they didn't actually give them any electrical current. They didn't do anything. They had these things, and they hummed a little bit, but not loudly, and they just kind of like held them up in their general area, and then told them it's done, and that was it. 2/3 of the people that participated complained of a headache later. 2/3, 66%, because they had been convinced that this was going to be the outcome, so then it became the outcome. And so things like this make the human studies very, very hard because our psychology is powerful and our brains are powerful. And really, we are trying to study something as complex as ourself. because we are ourselves studying ourselves. And so we have to ask is, do we even have the capacity to understand what we're studying, because we are only as complex as the thing that we are studying. And that gets to be kind of real quickly. So, purposes, again, understanding how people and societies work, because we want to do it better. If we can understand what leads people to mental disorders, or to unreasonable fears, or to social breakdown, or to poverty, or to war, and if we can ever understand that to the point that we can prevent it, or at least diminish it's like probability, then then we've done something remarkable. We've done something meaningful, right? We're not always chasing certainty in the human sciences. We are chasing improvement of our understanding, and then improvement of then our processes and our behaviors. Yeah. Um, but are the human sciences ever able to produce reliable laws? And the answer there is no. No. We can try to understand things and we can find relationships, but we'll never be able to make a scientific law that says doing this will always cause this, or this always causes this. We'll never be able to do that in the human sciences, because again, confirmation bias, questioner basis, difficulties in measurement, the observation of people changes their behavior, the problem of no controlled experiments. The human scientists are often muddled with moral and ethical issues, limitation, and the willingness to, and or the ability to experiment. For instance, we might be able to say, hey, burning somebody's feet every time that they say something that is untrue, uh, makes it so that way they stop lying after 3 months, right? We might someday be able, we might have the ability to prove a case like that, but no one is willing to do that experiment because the amount of harm that it would cause on somebody like that. For instance, there was a terrible experiment done a long time ago about human touch, where they had two babies, and one baby, they were both orphans, and one baby they gave regular nursing and regular nurse attention, and the other one, the nurse never actually touched the baby. They would always kind of just hold the bottle up here, or they would only ever touch the baby with gloves. The baby never got any skin cancer, and the or contact. And the baby that didn't get any contact did terribly. Did not develop normally. Had all kinds of problems, and that's a really interesting thing that is really important to know about, right? It tells us how to be better parents. It tells us how to better nurture young people. It tells us about the importance of touch and proximity, and being present in children's lives. But at what cost? Was a life ruined to gain that knowledge? And then how do you weigh the cost of that? And so that becomes majorly problematic. And then again, the human sciences can only suggest the probable. They can only find relationships, and they're very uncomfortable with the idea of falsification. With the idea, so if you remember back whenever I first talked about the sciences, I talked about the idea that good science, right, uses falsification, which is proving the ways that things don't work, right? So if I want to say that throwing a baseball at the window as hard as I can breaks it, right? Well, then I also want to see, does throwing the baseball not as hard as I can break it? Does throwing a baseball underhand break it? I want to come up with all these other ways of potentially falsifying the claim to really limit what we're saying is the causation here to what the actual causation is. So we rule out all of these other things and we get down to just the really specific things, and the human sciences really don't do a good job of that. So that's that. I'm going to have a brief assignment for you guys to do this week around the human sciences. That'll be up this week, as well as your weekly discussion post. I think next week is just going to be a catch up week on work because so many of you guys are behind, and it's going to be our last actual week of class before exams and before my grades are due. So I think next week we may just do a makeup grade week because you guys are all so cataclysmically behind. Not all, the vast majority of you are. But, anyways, I hope that rundown was helpful. Those of you that are actually going to graduate high school because you passed enough classes and go on to like college, you're going to run into a lot of the human sciences. So hopefully you will remember at least a little bit of this. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Um, I hope you're having a pleasant holiday season. I did exactly what I was going to do. Look at my house, right? So my house is all Christmas-fied over here, right? So living up the holiday life, as it were. I hope you guys are having a good holiday season as well. Might snow tomorrow. That'll be neat. Anyways, have a great one as always. If you need me, let me know. And deuces till then.